thanks everybody for joining. It's great to be here for this webinar series again, and excited to speak today. Up on the screen now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to cover today as we go through the program. First is just sharing some perspective on how data is changing the profession, and I think we've been talking about data analytics in internal audit for a very long time now, but I think it's really hit a point where some data about the industry itself is telling us it's really becoming, going from a nice-to-have part of the program to really an essential must. And along the way, I'd like to look at a case study that I'm going to share from a really fantastic customer of ACL's that I had the pleasure of giving this same presentation back at the IIA GAM conference with, and her story really resonated, so I wanted to share that today. We'll share a couple of examples of different types of data analysis and try and break down a little bit that question of really where to get started and what are the different ways in which data can be used. And I wanted to share hopefully a few resources along the way to help and kind of inspire your vision or your program for using data. Certainly, I hope that as we go through and spend an hour with us, at least my goal is to have everybody come out of this with at least one idea or one useful, something useful that you can take back and action immediately. And one thing that I might suggest looking at as we go through the presentation today is a link at the bottom of the page there that's www.acl.com/inspirations. And what that is just some specific by industry and by business process areas, places to use data analytics in the audit process. And as I present this content, which is quite general today, might find some ideas there on very specific cases where within your industry or within your process areas or risk areas that you're concerned about, some ideas on what kind of data analytics might be useful in your scenario. So to introduce myself, my name's Dan Zitting. I am the Chief Product Officer at ACL. And I also wanted to mention that, though by background, certainly I'm not actually a software person by background. I spent about 10 years in professional services for internal audit until writing some software along the way that I thought could help out in that process, and founded a small software company that was acquired by ACL, but certainly an IT auditor by background. I also wanted to introduce Laura Beland on the right side. Laura is not speaking with us, or is not on the webinar today, but I did want to share and credit her story, as it really, as I mentioned, really resonated for folks at the IIA GAM conference recently, and so we'll share her story in just a minute. But with that, I think that will bring us to our first poll question.
Yes, this is the first poll question that we'll have today, and while we give Dan a little bit of a break, we'll go ahead and just allow you to answer it. It should pop up in the middle of your screen. And this particular polling question asks, which of the following best describes your team or department's maturity and capability with data analytics? So this is a good chance to benchmark yourself against the attendees today. We have quite the large audience today. So when we show you the results, we do have over 1,500 people on today's webinar, so you can get a good sense of where you are compared to other people on the webinar. So we'll go ahead and give you all about a minute to answer the question. It should be showing up in the middle part of your webinar screen. And if you're having any problems with it, just hit F5. That usually refreshes your browser and allows you to answer the question. But while you're answering, what we do want to remind you is, as Dan's talking today, you do have the opportunity to send in questions related to the topics that he's sharing with you today, or to ask for him to expand upon certain thoughts and ideas. You can submit these questions throughout the webinar, and you are able to we'll be going through them, and then we do have some time at the end of the webinar. We'll be answering as many as possible. So just to share the poll results with everybody, we'll take a look at them right now. They should be in the middle of your screen, and it's 39.9% of you said that one or more isolated staff members have data analysis skills, and they use at least one data analysis tool beyond ACL and regularly do ad hoc data analytics. So that seems to be the leading answer out of the options that were provided. The second one was very little or to no ability outside of the general Excel use. And I don't think that answer surprises anybody, because this is, a topic that, everybody's really trying to get familiar with. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next polling question. And what we want to do is we will keep this open for about another minute, so hopefully you have enough time to answer this particular question. And this one asks, which of the following best describes your perspective on investing time and energy into advancing your team's data analytics capability? So this is a good follow-on question to the previous one. So there are some options, multiple choice on the middle of your screen. You can just select the one that you feel that fits your particular organization. So go ahead and choose the one that you think that fits you best. Remember, we have over 1,500 people on the screen, and then once we make it through this polling question, Dan will give his perspective on the results for the last two polling questions, and then he'll continue on with his presentation. And then, as a reminder, just go ahead and submit your questions to him throughout the webinar using the polling screen. So it looks like the poll results are coming up, so we'll go ahead and we'll go over them. So 37% of you said that we're making a little investment today, but my team has a good vision and appetite for it. So Dan, what do you think of these results and the previous ones as well?
Yeah, interesting results. I think the previous bit there was interesting around, of course, we often see the little skills beyond Excel and beginning to do some ad hoc analytics. But interestingly enough, about 18% of the webinar today has in fact, within their team, established a centralized data analysis function. And that's, I would say, having done webinars like this, 5 years ago, I would say that's up from maybe 5%. So good progress there. And then interesting here, I found that this is certainly the most common hurdle is gaining that support from outside stakeholders. So interesting to see that. But there are about 4% answered we make significant investment today, and for example, greater than 20% of our departmental budget, and believe it is a substantial dependency for our future success. Similar to the 4% that really understood data and platforms and that sort of thing on the previous results as well. And so it's interesting that we've got about 4% of the 1,500 or so folks on today who are really quite advanced. So that's interesting to see. Moving on, what I wanted to share now is just a couple of slides on some perspectives around data analysis and where kind of directionally it's heading. And I thought this was interesting data. I recently spoke with a major recruiter out on the East Coast in the U.S. and this recruiter was making comments about how difficult it had become for companies to recruit and retain really talented folks with the capability to manage data and data analysis. And I thought what was interesting is he said when we sign up a new client, what we ask that client establish for a baseline in terms of salary, or we won't take the job, is the numbers on this screen. So if you look at an experienced auditor at $83,000 compared to an experienced analytics expert at $123,000, obviously a big gap, which widens even substantially more where those companies and organizations that are going out of are taking the step to build an actual analytics and data analysis oriented teams. The leaders of those teams, the difference in the sorts of compensation that they're demanding are somewhat staggering, I found, to me. And it's hard for me to interpret that in any other way than to say, really analytics experts really are simply being valued by the business as the more valuable advisor than the traditional auditor. And of course, those skills being hard to find certainly only accentuates that. So in thinking about that, I recently had a conversation with one of the top analysts in governance, risk, and compliance at Forrester. And I thought she had a really interesting perspective as well, and quite an aggressive one in the sense of saying, it's kind of her opinion that the traditional auditor is quote, barreling toward obsolete and don't even realize it, as big data is beginning to solve problems at scale which auditors historically can't, not because of not being able to ask the right questions or those types of things, but even just based on the fact that the data can achieve so much scale that when looking at the breadth of problems and risk areas that organizations face today, there just simply aren't enough auditors. There just aren't enough auditors on earth to do it alone. And as data begins to play a role in looking after more of these risk areas, there's going to be less dependence on that sort of traditional approach, of course, to audit testing. So many of you have probably seen this study that I'm about to mention, but Oxford University did a study back in 2013 that I thought was really interesting. And basically the premise was back in the Industrial Revolution, robotics replaced many types of professions as automation replaced the need for factory workers and that sort of thing. Well, in the information age, and as the data robots, so to speak, become more and more prevalent, this study at Oxford took a look at what professions are likely to be automated away, and of course, one of the top results of that study, and you can find it simply by, if you just Google the future of employment, the study will be right at the top of the Google results, found 93.5% chance of accountants and auditors being automated away, which was obviously a somewhat terrifying result, but at least we did better than our friends who are tax preparers at a 98.7% chance. But in covering that study, I thought it was interesting. Handelsblatt, which is kind of like the Wall Street Journal in Germany, in covering that study, used a quote that I thought was really interesting. It said, "The data robots are coming to replace the auditors." And so, but with all of that kind of discussion floating about within the profession, I think in a lot of ways this promise and the buzzword of big data really still isn't delivering in audit. While there's lots of hype, in a lot of cases not nearly so much tangible, usable value, and often leading back to us reverting to kind of traditional methods of doing audit. And I think that was probably reflected in some of our poll results there as well. So interesting, when I spend time at conferences to hear the disdain for this phrase "big data" in our profession. Yet when I look across what's going on in industries like healthcare with evidence-based medicine and big data being used in solving or better administrating healthcare in really meaningful ways and better understanding patients, I look at that and say, well, the promise of big data is beginning to deliver, and I think it's certainly headed towards internal audit at a pace which we haven't previously seen. So I think the question then becomes, so what's the difference between an obsolescing internal auditor and this sort of transformative data-driven leader that certainly can exist within the internal audit department? And while everyone, I think, understands, auditors understand well the audit process, there's actually relatively few, I see, that truly understand, that can combine that with an understanding of data and the tools to analyze data, as well as, frankly, even fewer yet that really know the business and the right questions to look for. So in considering those three things, I think what begin to see emerging, and I spoke with the recruiter I talked about earlier, is more and more recruiting going on within audit teams from either other areas of the business or from other backgrounds and professions that can begin to blend those, kind of build that DNA into the team and begin to blend that with the audit process DNA that's already there to begin to develop and build that team that a leader can use to do a much more data-driven audit approach. And really, I think in a lot of ways, what we're trying to uncover are these powerful stories that are hidden in data, stories about the effectiveness of internal control, the effectiveness of risk management, ethics and regulatory compliance, performance, etc. And certainly these are unearthed by auditors every day. But as the tools advance, I've even recently seen more and more ways of more powerfully telling these stories in an engaging way. And so I spoke recently with a couple of different clients who have actually begun in certain cases to even do away with their traditional, multi-page, your standard internal audit reports in favor of using data and dashboarding type technologies to tell these data-driven stories about the outcomes of audits that are consumable without the multi-page report. And I see that as an interesting trend in saying what can actually be done to tell these stories with data. And so thinking about where to begin, and I think our poll results there at the beginning showed this interesting information about how many outside of the 4% who answered the last option on those questions, still struggling with figuring out how do I get scale, where do I begin, and I think these data-driven leaders, these transformative leaders that are really moving analytics forward, whether in internal audit or otherwise, are beginning to really break their work out into 3 different areas. One is certainly from an audit perspective, discovering what's important to focus on. So that includes using exploratory and profiling analysis, particularly with the use of data visualization tools. High-level visual exploration to identify risky patterns and just figure out what is the most impactful areas that I can be spending my time on. The second is automating away routine work. So using your more traditional kinds of data mining, anomaly detection, audit analytics tools to say what pieces of my program or what pieces of my audit plan can I just completely automate away through the power of data analysis and remove from the plates of our auditors and redirect that time into these other 2 areas of focus. And the third of those being looking forward with stories that impact. So again, using those data storytelling tools to give context to the data and actually tell stories that matter, but also in thinking about what really are risk analytics. It's thinking about statistics and ratios and metrics and those sorts of measurements that help our analysis look forward as opposed to always look into the past. And of course, the only buzzword that's as bad as big data out there is predictive analytics. And it's difficult to say exactly what that means, but transforming our analytics to be much more forward-looking is a key step, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So with kind of that as background, we'll shortly move into the case study, but we have our third poll question before we get there. LARC may not be there. So anyway, the third poll question is, which of these primary opportunities with data would you currently consider your highest priority or most beneficial? So again, data profiling to better understand the business overall, identify and recognize potential high-level risk patterns and aid in audit planning, or would you see more opportunity in data mining and analytics to test controls and compliance requirements, identify exceptions, and then the forward-looking was a smaller answer, and you can see the results of the poll on screen now. 53% saying all of the above. So I certainly agree with all of the above, while it can be a lot to bite off, because in a lot of ways it's different tools and techniques are important between these three different areas. But I think it still stands out that just getting some of the basic audit work automated away and red flag identification is the top priority. All right, thanks everybody for answering the poll question. So what I wanted to move on to next is sharing the story that I mentioned. Laura Belan from Texas Instruments presented with me on this topic down at the IAA GAM conference in Dallas, Texas this year. And I was amazed by how many of those organizations who are really looking for, what's the path and how long does it take and what's the investment necessary to build a data analytics program, how well her story resonated. So while I won't be able to share it nearly as well as she does, I still wanted to share it with you all today. So in going through that, just talk a little bit about the TI landscape and what her department looks like, creating kind of the infrastructure for this data analysis program, and where they're taking their audit process to be more data-driven, as well as what they see as their future in using risk analytics. So to begin with, TI is a very large company, obviously, $13 billion and quite high on the Fortune 500 list. 35 countries they operate in, 31,000 employees. Texas Instruments is lucky in their case, as they, from a data perspective, Laura operates off of a single global instance of SAP. Of course, lots of organizations aren't clearly so lucky, and of course they do have many other systems at TI as well. But that single instance of SAP really helped them get their program up and going. And they do have a strong code of conduct and ethics culture, as well as global policy and procedures and programs for disseminating those. In the case of TI, their department is 30 auditors and 4 directors. They are split, or they do have folks all around the world. But in their case, they have, just out of that group, only 2 dedicated full-time data analysts that report to Laura, and so I think it's interesting. They have some level of data skill across many of their auditors, but even taking the step to just dedicate those two individual full-time data analysts really helped, I think, build what you'll see as a mature and sustainable program with analytics as we move through here. So in building that program, they've been on about what Laura described as an 8-year journey, and I'll talk about the timeline a little bit here in just a moment. But going through that process of selling the program, obtaining buy-in, identifying the talent that would run it, defining objectives, and selecting the tools. Going through that exercise to build something that was sustainable and that they could defend both internally and with their auditors became a key piece of foundation for them to build their program on. And what was interesting is, I think, as she described it, when you looked back to 2008, 2009, they had licenses to analytics tools floating around their department, and just like the majority of folks answered our poll at the beginning of the session, they had a number of folks with some level of data analysis skills and a few licenses to tools floating around, and certainly doing some ad hoc analytics, but it wasn't systematic, and they looked at it and said, we're really not getting the value from data analytics that we think we potentially could, and that's when they took on this journey of building that infrastructure and building that foundation. So you can see almost through 2008, they spent working through that process of obtaining the buy-in and dedicating some dedicated talent that would work on analytics full time, and selecting what set of tools they were going to use. So as that moved into having a set team and going through the security and process to make sure that they had complete kind of real-time access to the key data necessary, they used that to formalize their continuous auditing program and their continuous auditing charter. So as we've done some ad hoc analytics, demonstrated the value, built the buy-in, now we can begin to really automate. And that's when they moved from a desktop-based analytics platform to a server-based analytics platform. And what a server-based analytics platform does is it's kind of like centralizing the talent. Using analytics on a server-based platform helped them centralize all of their knowledge, all of the analytics and capability they've built, centralize it in a central place so it's sustainable. And should you lose a data analyst to another company, for example, that all that great knowledge and capability and analytics don't walk out the door on that laptop with them. So in centralizing that program, centralizing the talent, really helped them establish trust. It centralized the data extractions and the security of the data as well, and gave them a really strong platform to begin to continue to move forward that continuous auditing program. And ultimately, that continuous auditing program reached over 200 scripts, analytics that they use to monitor various aspects of risk in the business all the time. So moving from there, they brought their international auditors onto the platform and began to think about, now that we've got this continuous auditing program, we've automated away some of the more mundane work, as we spoke about earlier. How do we incorporate this data mining into all of our audits that go on all the time? And that's kind of the process they've been going through and re-engineering their approach. So they've developed procedures to make sure that there's a way to get access to the data analysts and the data from all audit teams, and built these sorts of packages, or I like to refer to them as analysis apps, that sort of thing, where they could give and centralize their data repository, their analytics, and give all the auditors in the field access to those. And I think that made a real big difference for them, increased the demand on the program to the point of pushing them to acquire a new server, and then ultimately leading to the point where they ran that program, got solid value from it until just up till recently, where they're beginning to now reimagine and re-engineer their vision of their continuous auditing program, and thinking about how can we now formally make sure that data-driven approaches are included in every single audit, and ultimately work towards our vision of doing that more quantitative risk assessment with data analytics as part of the annual audit plan, and ultimately that more forward-looking type of analysis. So that's a lot to take in, but I hope it provides a case study about how working through the process, while it has been a multi-year journey for them, some of the key steps along the way that help them transform this kind of esoteric notion of analytics and big data into something very tangible and useful to the organization. So in the phases they're in now, in thinking about how do they build this data-driven audit approach and use data analytics inside of every audit? I like Laura's story, because in thinking through that, they're very well aligned to what I spoke about earlier in thinking about those different types of analysis, those different types of risk analytics, and where do they fit in the process. So understanding that, for example, in the planning portion of their audits, they're beginning to require data analysis to do exploratory and preliminary analysis to figure out where to focus on, as well as identifying the core red flags, so that it's as part of the actual audit field work, we're spending most of the time actually looking at anomalies and exceptions, as opposed to getting out to the field and sifting through samples of largely unimportant information. And then finally, of course, considering how do we use data in communicating our findings, and at what point do our findings or what we've found in this audit, at what point do we maybe consider transferring that into more of a monitoring approach and moving that into the continuous auditing program. So this is the slide I really like, because these were Laura's words, not mine, in the sense of that same thing around thinking about how do we separate out these different types of analysis and how do they fit together. So what she called exploratory analysis, or analysis of known data concurrent with understanding the process to provide greater insight. This is primarily, again, the use of data visualization tools to say, based on what we can see from a full population of data about a process or an entity, what should we be spending our time on? What's even material? And how can I get a better understanding of the underlying business process from that? And we'll show an example in just a second. With the preliminary analysis, that's using macro-level analytics to scope the audit by, again, excluding areas that weren't important. So, again, identifying those places where we either rarely have exceptions or there's no materiality, setting those aside. And then finally, the actual audit analytics they consider part of the planning phase of the audit, in that the analytical procedures are run, the analytics are run, the exceptions and anomalies are identified all ahead of time of going out into the field, so that as we go out to the field to do the testing, again, investigating only the outliers and exceptions. So these were, with regards to each of those three different types of analyses, these are the examples that Laura gave, and I thought they were good examples to share on each of those topics, and then I'll show from my own experience a little bit more advanced ones here a little bit later on. So beginning with that exploratory analysis, like we spoke about, using the data visualizations, and in this case, TI is a manufacturing company. As a manufacturing company, doing that exploratory analysis to say, we're going to go do an audit on shipping. That's a big part of their business. What are the different areas? What can I learn and understand about how we do shipping? So in the most simple example, some basic visualization here helped immediately clarify, hey, most of the shipping we do is air freight. There's some anomalies in other areas, but of course the big material chunks are air driven. And that just being one example of many in sort of exploratory visual analysis of the data helped the auditor to understand the shipping process and show up knowledgeable and with a sound understanding of the business when they actually show up in the field. Now, then in that preliminary analysis phase, so she'd like to categorize her duplicate payment test as it related to freight in the preliminary analysis. So in this case, by basically running an analysis that identified their freight bills that where they shared multiple of these same characteristics. So if a bill had the same origin and destination, the same cost, same carrier, same dates, those sorts of things, there's a pretty high likelihood that we paid for that shipping twice. And so now we're already down to a list, again, that can be investigated when we're out in the field, as opposed to broadly looking at just a sample of freight bills as part of the audit fieldwork process. And then the audit analytics. And so in this case, this was actually a statistical analytic that looked at freight rates compared to, in this case, I'm not sure what it was, shipping weight or something along that line, but said where are the real outliers from the norm, so that we can also identify and investigate those for whatever may have caused that substantial variation from the population in where those freight rates fit. So in summarizing and building that program, where they saw the biggest benefits and challenges, of course, the analyses of complete populations, targeting outliers, all this sorts of stronger evidence. These are the sorts of things that they just spent a lot more time on the right things to be looking at, but certainly over the course of 8 years, ran into the challenges of skill sets with auditors, the recruiting problem we talked about earlier, getting past the access to data challenge, applying analytical concepts, and really actually interpreting what was found with the analytics afterwards. All key challenges, and those where you have if any of those particular challenges resonate, please do submit a Q&A question. Whether we get to it on the webinar today or not, we'd be glad to share some tools and ideas to help you think through those challenges. So looking forward, now that they're, I think, pretty advanced at Texas Instruments and they're thinking about using analytics as part of every audit, the question becomes, how are we using analytics and deciding what to audit? And so thinking about their audit life cycle and looking in the future, their next big phase of evolution is what we talked about with the forward-looking and more predictive analytic type capability to think about risk assessment and how do we focus on the right things as part of our overall audit plan, and an interesting full challenge in that. And again, if you're interested to hear more or have interest in that particular, please submit a Q&A, and we'd be glad to share case studies of folks who have done that. So with that, with wrapping up TI's story, that will bring us to our fourth polling question. And then is LARC back?
Thank you. So we'll go ahead and stay on the screen for about 60 minutes before we move on to the results. So we want to make sure we have everybody, give everybody enough time to answer the question. So this particular question is, what is the most useful and impactful tool you feel like you don't have today that could immediately help you advance your vision, develop your outside report, and realize your success in this particular area? So there's some options for you to choose from. So go ahead and read through all of them. And while you're reading through them, we'll keep the screen up on the middle of your attendee console. And I'll go ahead and ask Dan a question that's come in. And it is, how do we as auditors go from being an experienced auditor to an experienced analytics expert?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the great thing about auditors is we already, as auditors, have the background for the hardest part of data analytics, which is, frankly, defining what's the right question to ask. I really do believe that being able to structure the right questions is the most difficult thing, and auditors are especially well suited for it. So then what's kind of the next phase? Well, so then how do you step from there to doing analytics? It's really getting an understanding of data. And I think that there's two pieces to that. One is, of course, your traditional training and that sort of thing as it relates to analytics. But what I found, and in particular, even in my own journey as an auditor, the first time I really used analytics was when I had a big problem that had come up that I had to was something I could really sink my teeth into to learn how to technically use the tools. So that would be my top recommendation. And I mentioned a link earlier that was the Inspirations link. Find one of those kinds of tests or one of those kinds of problems that you can really sink your teeth into and use it to learn the tools on a real business problem.
Thank you for that, Dan. So we'll go ahead and show everybody the results. So, Dan, if anything pops out of the results to you, go ahead and comment on it.
Yeah, so these results are quite interesting. I've never asked this question in a poll before, and of course I think things like what are my peers doing and ROI tools, those are common answers. But what stands out to me in these results is exactly just going back to your last question, LARC, is thinking about what are the standout answer was the top 20 risks and ideas where data analytics can be applied. I think 36% of people answered that. I think that's exactly, I really do believe that's the biggest challenge, is structuring. What are the right questions that I can be asking, and what are the right problems I can really sink my teeth into to show some value? So anybody who has additional questions on that, again, please feel free to submit them, and we'd be glad to share. Resources on that. All right, outstanding. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in that poll. So I wanted to share a couple of examples as well, just to get you thinking some more about what are the kinds of things we can be doing with analytics. And so these are examples from my own experience and from my own role in looking after the risk management program inside of ACL. So within those same contexts of discovering what's important to focus on, how do we automate away more mundane work, and how do we get predictive, and how do we look forward going forward? These are some examples that I've worked with myself. And so this is certainly not, I'm going to share some screenshots and things here. I'm not going to talk about what tools they are. This isn't intended to be any kind of a pitch on tools. It's more about the process and the sorts of learning that some of the learning I've had recently. So this first one, I'm going to use an example we call Index of Customer Engagement. So we have a really smart guy inside of ACL. His name is Jose, who built some analytics to develop this thing we call an ICE score. So for ACL, probably our biggest risk area, and I highly recommend doing an analytic like this for any commercial organizations that have customers and a customer-centric focus. Our biggest risk is that our customers are happy and engaged with us. And so this analytic was something Jose built to look at various aspects of our engagement with our customers, ranging from are they submitting support tickets to are they active on our user communities, all kinds of different things that said how engaged is a particular customer with us, and scored them from 0 to 100 for each customer. And that's really, really impactful because it helps us begin to do some things like some data profiling. So in this case, we were just doing some data profiling to understand our average ICE score, our average index of customer engagement by country. So I can immediately, based on the results of this analytic, I immediately have some profiling and information about how our customers interact with us that I would have never seen previously at such a data-driven level. So interestingly enough, it's good for us to know and understand, hey, if you're a customer in Slovakia, boy, are you really active with us, whereas we could be working harder in a place like South Korea. And that's the sort of information that data profiling can really very quickly drive out. And the same thing as Laura was mentioning, that more analytic or data mining and exception identification approach. This happens to be a visualized view of that same thing, correlating the index of customer engagement for each customer to how large that customer is by number of employees. So the idea being here is that those customers that are less engaged but also much larger employees, those dots that are in the bottom right quadrant of this correlation, this was really simple to produce, but very quickly shows me who are those really big companies that ACL should be much more engaged with than we are today, and I can instantly go back to the business and say, hey, what's going on with these customers? Do we have a risk of losing them as customers, or is there an opportunity to just get more engaged with them? We can spend the time, and the meat of our discussion, even from sort of an audit approach of our customer experience, on those specific cases rather than en masse the mass of customers that are generally in the right place. Now, I mentioned storytelling with data, and I think this is an example that begins to get at it. It's our kind of ICE operational dashboard. But the point that I want to make here is that charts and graphs in and of themselves are just charts and graphs. What really matters is if we can tell the story effectively, putting together the results of analysis with the commentary that actually matters, the insight that's actually drawn from it in a way that's consumable and easy to follow in a story, I think is what makes this impactful, and what actually, in our case, what helped an analytic like this really gain traction with the business, help them consume it well, and actually turned it into action to make our business better. So moving from there into thinking about, okay, so then how could we automate away a lot of the routine work? Well, you can take the same approach in saying, well, now that we've done this sort of profiling, we've done some audits to see where we have issues in our customer experience, how do we leave that behind so that the business is looking after this going forward, and that we get much better results the next time we come around? And just by way of example, this is, moving from something like that that's literally just a step, that's a step in an audit program like any other, being able to say in my documentation or in my evidence, in the capture of evidence of that particular program, how can I capture and include the results of this analysis and the discussion and impact that it had, so that we can say, wow, that was a really useful audit step. Let's take that one step further and convert that over to some kind of, to a sort of, we're seeing these exceptions, we'll see other exceptions in the future, but how do we turn that into something automated that actually looks after itself going forward? So in this case, we've built a process that says, hey, if the condition is, there's more than 100 users at this customer, and if it's in this particular region, then assign out that exception out to this person in the business, notify a particular user. Building that kind of process and workflow around these analytics, we see in about 30 to 40% of all of our customers, if they reach that level of success with analytics, 30 to 40% of the time, we'll see the business look interested and willing to take over these analytics and build that workflow to then monitor it on an ongoing basis. And I think that's a huge value add and handoff to the business. And so, and finally, as we get down to the end of our time, I just wanted to share an example from another customer that I worked with. In this case, a more thinking about how can we be predictive and how can we look forward. This particular customer had run into some stumbles with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where they'd gotten a little bit of hot water for some bribery issues, and so they built this great monitoring program, like we just talked about, that had analytics that had identified these potential bribe transactions that had happened in the past and routed them out to the business to resolve. But they wanted to say, how can we take that and look forward? And so by taking an analytic like that and evolving it forward with some very basic knowledge of statistics and some very basic third-party data, in this case things like the CPI index for the corruption likelihood index for various countries, we could apply that analytic and that statistical knowledge to the forecasted revenue of the company and say, based on all of this activity we've seen in the past, here is a forecast of where we might be likely to see bribery or corruption-related issues and transactions in the future, so that ahead of time the business and proactively go out and say, hey, if we're going to spend time on monitoring this or putting policies in place, here's the key areas we should be doing it in. So again, any questions on that, feel free to share them, and be glad to provide some more details on how something like that's accomplished. And so with that, again, getting close to the end of our time, we have our last poll question.
Yes, so this is the last poll question, so go ahead and answer it. It has popped up on your screen, and it reads, did you take home at least one actionable insight or resource that you might be able to use to take a positive step forward with your team. And this is, focused on the topic we've been talking about today, and that's, using data analytics within your internal audit function. So there are some easy to read options for this particular polling question. So go ahead and answer that. And while you're answering that, we'll go ahead and move into the formal Q&A portion of the webinar. We have received a number of good questions. This is a hot topic out in the marketplace, hot topic for audit shops. So Dan, the first question I'm going to send to you or send your way is, would you recommend having a dedicated analytics function with a few people or having an entire staff receive training on this topic?
My contention would be is that I think it's in many ways I don't think that's an either or question, and I think it's important to do both. But what we've certainly seen is if you can dedicate a few people to it, we just tend to see the programs get a lot more traction quite quickly, and the ability to find those quick wins. And as folks see that result, we find other auditors in the group very quickly begin to kind of latch on. So in the case of the Texas Instruments story I shared, one of the comments to me there was, it was really what transformed our program, and what really got us going was dedicating people, because next thing you know, once we had a capability within the team to do this, everybody else wanted to submit ideas for them, wanted to get access to the data, and began to take off and kind of expand from there.
Great. So we'll go ahead and look at the results. It looks like 84% of people said that they found at least one concept potentially useful, so that's good. So while I prep for the next question, what do you think of these results?
Well, that was obviously quite a self-serving question for my own feedback, but it's rather nerve-wracking to ask a question like that and display the results in public. So I'm glad. Hopefully, like you said, the majority of folks found something useful.
Good. Yeah, we had a great audience today. So the next question that we'll cover during this session is, how do you move management towards the forward-looking audit management focus when most are interested in where we have been?
Oh, that's a great question. I think in many cases it depends on kind of your unique circumstances. But what we've certainly, what I feel like I've often seen is there's the sort of the compliance or must-cover aspects of our jobs as auditors that we must do. But the folks I've seen have success with beginning to take that more forecasting or that more forward-looking approach is that they built, on the side or whatever, they've built some of that. Some of those sorts of perspectives in the case of the customer I shared there, that bribery example, that said, here's the possibility. If you think about it this way, here's how we might be able to get ahead of this problem. Let me illustrate how we might be able to think forward about this and work forward and build some sort of traction based on an actual example and some actual data that management can see and understand the value of, rather than kind of talking it through in concept, so to speak.
Great. Thank you for that answer. So I'll go through one more question, and this question is, with the gap in data analytics skill sets, have you seen any universities offering academic courses to help fill this gap?
That's a fantastic question. I really wish we would see far more universities include data analytics, particularly in the business and accounting and auditing type coursework. We don't see a lot of those. There are a few. I would call out one great example is Rutgers University, who has an actual audit analytics certificate program, as well as audit analytics graduate programs. I think they're really taking a step out there in the academic community. Also see more graduate programs and things like, I know, for example, Northwestern, I know, has professional master's degree program in predictive analytics and things like that. So I think there's more of that beginning to emerge, but I sure wish it would become a bigger part. What I don't see coming around fast enough is I'd love to see a bigger part of the core business curriculum focused on data analytics. Great question.
Well, we're near the end of our hour. Dan, thank you for presenting today. We had a great audience, great number of questions, and if any of you have further questions for Dan, Dan has provided some ways to get a hold of him through LinkedIn and some other inspirational links on this particular topic. So thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Dan, for presenting, and we'll have a great day.
Thank you so much.